The high desert of the Wyoming Territory was a place that didn't know mercy. It swallowed mistakes and buried secrets. For 18-year-old Abigail Monroe, that truth was as clear as the stars in the unforgiving night sky. But when a cry, thin as a thread, cut through the twilight, she was faced with a choice that would defy every rule of survival. She found a life that didn't belong. She hid an infant from the Cheyenne tribe, first from the Coyotes and then from the men of her own town. But as she concealed the child beneath her father's forge, the first, distant boom echoed from the valley. The drums had started, and they were coming. The Wyoming Territory in 1876 was not a land for the faint of heart. It was a sprawling, brutal canvas of alkali dust, jagged rock, and a sky so vast it threatened to swallow you whole. The settlement of Red Rock Basin was a scar on this landscape, a dozen timber and sod buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the relentless wind. It was a place of last chances, populated by men who had failed elsewhere, and women who had no other choice. 18-year-old Abigail Monroe understood this land. She had been shaped by it. Her mother was buried in its unyielding soil, taken by a fever 3 winters past, leaving Abigail with her father, Thomas Monroe, the town blacksmith. Thomas was a man of iron and silence, his grief forged into a hard, quiet pragmatism. Abigail had inherited his resilience, but she kept a spark of her mother's softness, a dangerous thing to possess in a place like Red Rock. On this particular evening, the sun was bleeding out behind the western canyons, staining the clouds a violent shade of purple and orange. Abigail was a mile from the settlement, her basket heavy with soaproot and yarrow. She'd strayed farther than she should have, lured by a patch of wild thyme. And now the chill of the high desert night was beginning to seep into her bones. The air was still, holding its breath before the dark. And then she heard it. It wasn't the yip of a coyote or the shriek of a hawk. It was a cry, thin and reedy, almost lost in the rustle of the sagebrush. Abigail froze. Her hand went to the small skinning knife on her belt. Every settler knew the stories, war parties using a child's cry as bait. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the jagged line of rocks and brush, seeing nothing but shadows. The town was a distant smudge of smoke. She was alone. The cry came again, weaker this time, punctuated by a series of sharp, guttural barks. Coyotes. The fear of a trap was instantly replaced by a different kind of dread. She moved slowly, pushing aside a curtain of brittle rabbit brush. The tracks in the dust told a story of panic and flight. A woman's moccasin prints, deep and frantic, heading east. And then, the cradle board. It was tucked into a hollow at the base of a sandstone boulder, partially shielded by a thorny greasewood bush. It was Cheyenne, unmistakably. The hide was tanned to a soft pearl grey, and the beadwork was intricate, a pattern of blue and white that seemed to glow in the twilight. Inside, swaddled in rabbit fur, was a baby. Its face was streaked with dust and tears, its dark eyes wide with terror. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. A few yards away, the ground was torn up. Dark, coppery stains soaked the alkali dirt. There were no bodies, but the scent of death was heavy in the air. A skirmish. A mother, running for her life, had made an impossible choice: hide her child and run, hoping to draw off the pursuit or die with it. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, then another. The coyotes. A pack of 5, their ribs showing through patchy fur, slunk out from the rocks. Their yellow eyes were fixed on the cradle board. The leader, a scarred male with a mangled ear, growled low in its throat, tasting the air. They weren't afraid of her. They were hungry, and she was one girl against 5. The baby let out a wail. "No," Abigail whispered. Her mind screamed at her to run. This was not her fight. This was an Indian baby. Bringing it to Red Rock was suicide. Leaving it was murder. The scarred coyote lunged, not at her, but at the cradleboard. "Get back!" Abigail screamed. She didn't think. She snatched the cradleboard, swinging her heavy herb basket in a wide arc. The basket connected with the coyote's snout with a heavy thud. The animal yelped, surprised, and stumbled back. Abigail clutched the cradleboard to her chest. The baby, startled by the motion, fell silent. She backed away, her eyes locked on the pack. They fanned out, circling her. The scarred leader snarled, saliva dripping from its jaws. "Go on! Get!" she yelled, her voice trembling. She knew she couldn't outrun them, not while carrying the heavy, awkward cradleboard. Her eyes darted around, searching for a weapon, a refuge. There was nothing but open ground between her and the town. The scarred coyote lunged again. Abigail kicked out, her heavy boot catching it in the chest. It was a glancing blow, but it bought her a second. She turned and ran. She ran as she had never run before, her lungs burning, the weight of the child pulling at her arms. The coyotes gave chase, their barks and howls echoing in the growing dark. They were fast, nipping at her heels. One snagged the hem of her calico dress, and she heard the fabric rip. She stumbled, nearly falling, but kept her grip on the child. She could see the flickering lights of Red Rock, see the plume of smoke from her father's forge. It was so close. The howling was right behind her. She could feel the hot breath of the lead coyote on her leg. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she burst through the scrub and onto the main dusty track of the town. A man smoking a pipe on the porch of the general store looked up, his eyes wide. "Coyotes!" Abigail gasped. "Big pack!" The man, startled, kicked back his chair and grabbed a rifle leaning against the wall. He fired a shot into the air. The explosion cracked through the twilight. The coyotes, wary of the settlement and the gunshot, skidded to a halt at the edge of the light, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers. They howled, a frustrated, hungry sound, and melted back into the shadows. Abigail didn't stop. She ran past the man, past the saloon, her feet pounding the dirt until she reached the forge at the end of the track. She threw open the heavy door and stumbled inside, collapsing against it, her chest heaving. The forge was hot and smelled of coal smoke and iron. Her father, Thomas, looked up from the anvil, his hammer raised. His face, lean and etched with worry lines, darkened. "Abigail! What in God's name? I told you to be back before—" His words died when he saw the cradleboard clutched in her arms. He dropped the hammer. The clang rang through the silence. "Abby," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What have you done?" Thomas Munro moved with a slow, deliberate dread. He barred the heavy wooden door to the forge and lowered the shutters over the two small windows, plunging the smithy into the dim, flickering light of the dying fire. "Tell me," he commanded, his voice flat. Between ragged breaths, Abigail told him. The cry, the tracks, the coyotes. Thomas listened without moving, his broad shoulders slumped. He was a powerful man, his arms corded with muscle from a lifetime at the anvil. But in that moment, he looked old and defeated. He walked over and gently pulled back the fur lining of the cradleboard. The baby was quiet now, its small, perfect face calm in sleep, unaware of the storm it had brought. "It's Cheyenne," Thomas stated the obvious. His hand, calloused and stained with soot, hovered over the child's head, unwilling to touch it. "Abby, you know what this means. You know what they'll do." "He's a baby, Pa," Abigail said, her voice shaking but firm. She clutched the cradleboard tighter. "I couldn't just let them take him. The coyotes." "Better the coyotes than us," Thomas said, the word sounding like grit in his mouth. "Do you think Silas Croft cares about coyotes? Do you think the men in that saloon will care? They see this," he jabbed a finger at the intricate beadwork, "and they see war. They see the raids. They see the Hannigan family." The name hung in the hot, smoky air. The Hannigans, a family on a homestead 10 miles east, had been killed 2 months prior. The town, led by the charismatic and terrifying Silas Croft, had blamed the Cheyenne. It was the reason the basin was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. "This," Thomas said, his voice dropping, "is the spark, Abigail." "What do you want me to do?" she cried, tears of frustration and fear finally welling. "Take him back out? Leave him in the dark?" Thomas scrubbed his face with his hands. "No, no. God help us, no." He paced the dirt floor, his mind racing. "We can't keep him here. Not in the house." "Where then?" Thomas stopped and stared at the floor. In the corner, under a pile of rusted horseshoes and broken wagon wheels, was a heavy trapdoor. "The cellar," he said. Abigail's blood ran cold. The root cellar wasn't part of their small attached cabin. It was a pit dug beneath the forge itself, designed to keep root vegetables and perishables cool, even with the fire blazing above it. It was cold, airless, and filled with spiders. "Pa, no, it's a hole. He'll freeze, or suffocate." "He'll be found if he's anywhere else," Thomas said, his voice regaining its iron resolve. "The walls of the cabin are thin. One cry, that's all it will take." He grabbed a lantern and lit it. "Get the old blankets from my chest. And your mother's. Get the small cradle. The one I made." Abigail's heart broke. The small wooden cradle had been her mother's hope for a second child, a child that never came. It had been stored in the rafters, a monument to their family's loss. As Thomas cleared the junk from the trapdoor, Abigail ran to the cabin. She grabbed the blankets, a tin of condensed milk, and a clean rag. She found the cradle, dusting it off, her hands trembling. When she returned, Thomas had the door open. A wave of cold, earthy air hit them. The lantern light barely penetrated the blackness. The cellar was small, not even tall enough for Thomas to stand upright in. "He can't stay down there," Abigail whispered, horrified. "He stays," Thomas said, "until we can figure out what to do. Maybe a patrol from Fort Laramie will pass through. We can give him to them. They'll just take him to a reservation, or worse. That's not our concern, Abby. Our concern is surviving the night." Carefully, Abigail placed the sleeping infant into the small wooden cradle. She wrapped him in the thickest wool blankets. Thomas set the lantern in a niche, turning the flame as low as it would go. "It'll burn for a few hours," he said. "It's all the air it'll have." They looked at the child, a tiny, peaceful island in a sea of darkness. I'll have to go down and feed him," Abigail said, her stomach turning at the thought of the close, cold dark. "Every few hours. And you're quiet about it. Not a word, not a sound. Do you understand me, Abigail?" "I understand." Thomas heaved the heavy trap-door back into place. The sound of its sealing was heavy, final, like a coffin lid. They had just finished scattering the scrap iron back over the door when a sharp, insistent knocking came from the main forge door. Thomas and Abigail froze, looking at each other in naked panic. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice a passable imitation of weary annoyance. "It's Martha Pratchett, Thomas Munro, and I'd like a word." Mrs. Pratchett was the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief gossip. She was a thin, bird-like woman whose husband had run off 3 years ago, leaving her with a sharp tongue and a lot of free time. Thomas unbarred the door, opening it just a crack. "Evening, Martha. It's late. The forge is closed." "I'm sure it is." She sniffed, peering past him into the gloom. Her eyes darted everywhere. "I was just speaking with Mr. Abernathy at the general store. He said he saw your Abigail running as if the devil himself was on her heels." "It was coyotes, Mrs. Pratchett," Abigail said, stepping forward. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to hide their shaking. "A whole pack. Gave me a fright." Mrs. Pratchett's gaze sharpened. "Coyotes, you say? Mr. Abernathy said he heard a sound before the gunshot. He said it sounded almost like a cry." "The coyotes were howling," Thomas said, his voice like gravel. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're tired." "Of course," Mrs. Pratchett said, but she didn't move, her eyes fixed on the ripped hem of Abigail's dress. My. They got close, didn't they? Tore your dress clean." She then looked at the ground. "And you're tracking a powerful lot of mud in here, Abigail. Funny, seeing as it ain't rained in a month." Abigail looked down. Her boots and the hem of her dress were caked with the dark, damp earth from the arroyo where she'd found the baby. It was different from the dry, powdery dust of the town. I was down by the creek bed, looking for Root," Abigail lied. "The creek bed, all alone, at dusk?" Mrs. Pratchett smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "You are a bold girl, Abigail Munro, very bold." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You'd best be careful. There are things worse than coyotes out in the dark. Things that don't belong." She turned and walked away, her footsteps disappearing into the night. Thomas closed the door and rebarred it. He leaned against it, his eyes closed. "She knows," he whispered. "She doesn't know what she knows, but she's smelling a secret. She'll go to the sheriff, or worse, she'll go to Croft." And as if summoned by the name, a new sound entered the night. Not a knock. The heavy, confident footsteps of a man wearing military-grade boots and the jingle of spurs. The footsteps stopped right outside their door. They didn't knock. They just waited. Abigail held her breath, staring at the door. Her heart felt like it would burst. "Please don't cry," she prayed to the child hidden beneath the floor. "Please, please don't cry." After a full minute of agonizing silence, the footsteps moved on, heading toward the lights of the saloon. Thomas let out a shaky breath. "Go to the cabin," he ordered. "Act normal. Eat your supper. I'm going to stay in here. Stoke the fire. Make it look like I'm working late." Abigail nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She slipped out the back door into their small, two-room cabin. She sat at the rough-hewn table, but she couldn't eat. She could only listen to the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of her father's hammer hitting the anvil, a desperate, defiant noise in the gathering dark. It was the sound of a man trying to pretend that the world wasn't about to end. The saloon in Red Rock Basin was called The Last Drop. It was a fitting name. It was a long, narrow room that smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and desperation. When Silas Croft pushed through the bat-wing doors, the low murmur of conversation and the tinny plink of the piano died instantly. Croft was not a large man, but he occupied space as if he were. He was wiry and sun-blackened, with pale blue eyes that seemed to have no bottom. He wore a patched U.S. cavalry jacket, long stripped of its insignia, and a hat with a snakeskin band. A Henry rifle was looped in his saddle scabbard, but it was the pair of Colt revolvers at his hips, worn low and tied down, that held the room's attention. He moved with a predator's economy of motion. He had been a scout for the army, a bounty hunter, and some whispered, a scalper. He'd arrived in Red Rock 2 months ago, right after the Hannigan raid, and had appointed himself the town's unofficial protector. He led the militia, a group of bored, scared young ranch hands and prospectors who he'd filled with whiskey and hate. He walked to the bar, and the men pulled back to give him space. "Sheriff," Croft said, his voice a dry rasp. Sheriff Brodie, a man whose gut hung over his belt and whose face was perpetually beaded with sweat, nodded nervously. Silas. What's the word? Brodie was an elected official, which meant he was a politician, and he knew his political survival depended on staying on Croft's good side. Croft laid a single eagle feather on the bar. Found this 3 miles east of the basin. Fresh. A nervous ripple went through the room. They're close, Croft said, enjoying the fear he was creating. A small war party. We tracked them from the north. Had a skirmish near the Powder River. Did you engage them? Sheriff Brodie asked, wiping his palms on his trousers. We engaged them, Croft said with a thin-lipped smile. Scattered 'em. Sent 'em running with their tails between their legs. But one of the squaws got away. She was carrying something. Something important. He leaned in, and the men at the bar leaned in with him. They weren't just a random party. They were an escort for the new son of Black Moon. The name landed like a physical blow. Black Moon was the leader of the local Cheyenne band, a man renowned for his tactical brilliance and his unwillingness to be pushed onto a reservation. He was a symbol of resistance, which, to the settlers, made him a monster. His son? Brodie stammered. An infant, Croft said. The woman ran. My guess is she headed for the basin, thinking she could hide in the canyons. She was wounded. My trackers found her horse. She's on foot. A drunk prospector at the end of the bar slammed his glass down. Then what are we waiting for? Let's ride! Find the witch and her brat! Croft held up a hand. The room fell silent. Patience, gentlemen. This is a delicate opportunity. He turned to Brodie. Sheriff, I need you to deputize my men. We need to search the town. Every house, every shed. She might have slipped in. Search the town? Brodie balked. Silas, you can't just... These are people's homes. Croft's pale eyes hardened. That brat, as our friend here so eloquently put it, is a bargaining chip. Black Moon will give up anything to get him back. Land rights, gold locations. He might even agree to move his people north of the Yellowstone for good. He paused, then added, or, if the child is lost, he'll bring a war that will make the Hannigan business look like a church picnic. We must find that child. Croft's motive was clear, though he didn't state it. He didn't want to save the baby. He wanted to possess it. It was leverage. A child was a better hostage than 1,000 bullets. All right, Brodie said, his shoulders slumping. I'll authorize a search. Tomorrow. At first light. Tonight, Croft said. Silas, you can't. Tonight, Croft repeated, his voice soft, but with the flat, deadly finality of a closing steel trap. We'll start now. Quietly. He turned and walked out, his spurs chiming. His militia, who had been waiting outside, fanned out into the darkness. Meanwhile, Abigail was in her cabin, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She couldn't hear the baby. Was he breathing? Was he cold? Was he dead? The clang, clang, clang of her father's hammer was the only thing keeping her sane. Around midnight, the hammering stopped. Her father came in, his face grim. I'm going to sleep in the forge, he said. In case. He cries. You stay here. I need to feed him, Pa. I'll do it. You? I know how, he said curtly. Just stay put. He took the tin of milk and a cup of water, slipping back into the forge and barring the door. Abigail was left alone in the cabin. She lay on her cot, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening. She must have dozed because she was jolted awake by a sound. It wasn't the baby. It was a low, booming thud. She sat bolt upright. Her blood turned to ice. Boom! A pause. Boom! It was a drum, far away but unmistakable. It was coming from the canyons, from the valley. Boom! 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 It was a slow, steady heartbeat, a sound of mourning or a sound of searching. She scrambled from the cot and ran to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. Lights were flickering on all over Red Rock. Men were shouting. A dog started barking, a frantic, terrified sound. She ran to the door connecting the cabin to the forge. "Pa!" she hissed, rattling the knob. The door was unlocked. She burst in. Her father was standing over the open trap door, his face ashen. He wasn't looking down. He was looking at the main forge door. "Pa, did you hear it?" "Get down," he whispered. "Get in the cellar. Now." "What?" "There's someone outside. They were just at the window. Get in. Hide." Before she could protest, he was pushing her toward the dark, open square in the floor. "Pa! No, Do it, Abigail!" He practically threw her in. She stumbled down the rickety ladder, landing on the cold dirt floor. The baby, in his small cradle, let out a small mew. "Shh, shh," she whispered, her hands shaking as she scooped him up. Above her, she heard her father heave the trap door shut. The darkness was total. A second later, the heavy pile of scrap metal was dragged back into place, sealing her in. She was buried alive. She clutched the baby, her own breath roaring in her ears. The cellar smelled of damp earth and rot, and then, through the tons of dirt and iron above her, she heard it. The heavy thud of a rifle butt on the main forge door. "Thomas Monroe!" a voice barked. It was Silas Croft. "Open this door, by order of the sheriff. We're searching every building." Abigail put her hand over the baby's mouth, and her own, to stop from screaming. Above her, Abigail could hear the muffled sounds of her father's boots on the dirt floor. She heard the heavy bar being lifted, the creak of the door. "It's the middle of the night, Silas," her father's voice, strained and rough. "The drums woke us." Croft's voice, smooth and cold. "Seems the locals are restless. We're doing a sweep, making sure one of them didn't sneak in. Looking for contraband. I've got nothing here but iron and coal. Then you won't mind if we look." Abigail's world shrank to the small, cold, black space. The baby in her arms squirmed, and she rocked him frantically, whispering, "Shh, shh, shh," her lips brushing the soft fur he was wrapped in. He was warm. He was alive. She could hear multiple sets of boots in the forge. They were walking around. She heard a clang as one of them kicked a bucket. "Working late, Smithy?" Croft asked. The voice was closer now. He was near the trap door. "Can't sleep with that noise," Thomas replied. "The drums?" "Yes. They have a way of getting under your skin, don't they? Makes a man anxious. Makes him remember things he'd rather forget." There was a heavy thud directly above Abigail's head. One of Croft's men had kicked the pile of scrap. "What's under this, Monroe?" a new voice asked, gruff. "Scrap," Thomas said. "Broken, useless, like most things in this town." "You got a root cellar?" Croft asked. His voice was right there. He was standing on the trap door. Abigail's heart stopped her. She could feel the pressure of his weight through the thick wood. The baby chose that moment to let out a tiny, hiccuping gasp. It was impossibly small. A mouse's squeak. Silence. The world went silent. The footsteps stopped. The drums far away seemed to get louder, filling the void. Boom, boom, boom. "What was that?" Croft's voice, sharp as a razor. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, Pa, think of something." "Rats," Thomas said, his voice hard. "Cellar's full of 'em. Big as cats. I'd move, Silas, less you want one running up your britches." There was another long pause. Abigail could hear Croft's boot scrape on the trap door. "Move this junk," Croft ordered. "No," Thomas said. "What did you say to me, Smithy?" "I said, no, it's my property. You ain't got a warrant. You ain't got a right. You can search the house. You can search the forge. But you ain't digging through my scrap heap in the middle of the night because you thought you heard a rat." This was a new father. This was not the quiet, grieving man. This was the man who had hammered hot iron for 20 years. Abigail could almost feel the tension in the air above her. Croft was deciding. Was this insubordination worth a fight, or was it the bluff of an innocent, tired man? "You're drawing a hard line, Monroe," Croft said softly. "I'm a simple man, Croft. I work iron. I sleep. And I don't like being woken up. Now, are you done?" The drums seemed to quicken. Boom, 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 boom. "For now," Croft said. She heard his weight shift off the door. "But I'm warning you. This town, it's on a knife's edge. And when it falls, you'd best be on the right side." The footsteps retreated. The main door of the forge creaked shut. The bar slammed back into place. Abigail didn't move for a full minute. She waited until she heard her father's hands, trembling, begin to shift the metal. The trap door was scraped back. A square of dim lantern light flooded the cellar. Her father's face was pale, glistening with sweat. "Get out," he hissed. "Get out now." He pulled her and the baby out. Abigail was shaking so violently she could barely stand. "They'll be back," Thomas said, pacing. "He knows. He sensed it. He just needed a reason. The rat. He didn't buy it." "Pa! The drums!" Abigail said, her teeth chattering. "They're so loud." "I know." Thomas ran his hands through his hair. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, Abby." It was the first time she had ever heard him admit it. A new sound. Not the drums. A scratching. At the back door, the one that led to the cabin. A low, persistent scratch, scratch, scratch. Thomas grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth. He nodded at Abigail, who ducked behind the anvil, clutching the baby. Thomas crept to the door and listened. The scratching came again. He lifted the bar and cracked the door. "Who?" A figure stumbled in, pulling the door shut behind him. It wasn't Croft. It was Old Man Jedediah. Jedediah was the town lunatic, or so everyone thought. A failed prospector who lived in a dugout shack by the creek. He spent his days panning for gold that wasn't there and talking to himself. He was ancient, smelled of cheap whiskey and wood smoke, and was generally considered harmless. Jedediah? What in hell? Thomas breathed, lowering the poker. The old man ignored him. He was staring, his eyes wide and surprisingly sharp, at the bundle in Abigail's arms. He shuffled over to her. Abigail shrank back, but he just reached out a gnarled, dirt-caked finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. "So it's true," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What's true?" Thomas demanded. "What are you doing here?" "I saw her," Jedediah said, his eyes still on the baby. "Saw the girl running, saw the coyotes, but I saw what she was carrying, saw the board." You saw?" Abigail was horrified. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Say anything to who?" Jedediah scoffed. "To Croft? To that tin star coward Brody? I ain't no friend of theirs." He looked around the forge, his eyes darting. "You're fools, all of you." "What are you talking about?" Thomas said, his patience snapping. "The drums," Jedediah said, pointing a finger at the ceiling. "You think they're war drums, don't you? You think they're coming to kill you all?" "Aren't they?" Abigail asked. "No, girl, not yet." The old man's expression became something else. Not madness. It was an ancient sadness. That ain't a war song. That's a hochester, a seeking song. They're looking for him." Thomas and Abigail stared. You speak their tongue?" "Was a captive," Jedediah said, his eyes distant. For 2 winters. Long time ago. Before I was this." He shook his head, as if clearing a fog. "They're not just looking for a chief's son. That beadwork, the white and blue, the symbol of the Vonoke." "The what?" "The sacred child," Jedediah breathed, his voice filled with awe. "A child of prophecy, born under the last full moon. They believe he's the one who will unite the tribes, the one who will, well, the one they've been waiting for." He looked at them, and the perceived madness in his eyes was replaced by a terrible, lucid clarity. "You ain't just hiding a baby, girl. You're hiding their future, and they will not stop. They will tear this valley apart, stone by stone, until they find him." "Then we have to give him back," Thomas said, lunging for the cradleboard. "No!" Abigail shielded the child. "You give him to who, you damned fool?" Jedediah snapped. "You walk out there. That child's mother and father will put an arrow through you before you get 10 feet. You give him to Croft? He'll try and sell him, and when the trade goes bad, which it will, the war will start, and we'll be the first to burn." Thomas was trapped. He sank onto his anvil, his head in his hands. "We're dead. We're dead either way." "No," Jedediah said. "There's one way, but it's a hell of a risk." "What?" Abigail asked, her voice desperate. "The mother," Jedediah said. "She's out there. The song. It's for her, too, to guide her. She'll be searching. If we can get the child to her, and only her, maybe. Just maybe." "And how do we do that?" Thomas asked, "with Croft's men on every corner and 100 Cheyenne warriors in the valley?" Jedediah smiled, a gap-toothed, cunning expression. "Croft ain't the only one who knows this valley. I've been prospecting these canyons for 20 years. There's tunnels, old mining shafts, ways in and out that ain't on any white man's map." He pointed to the cellar. Does that connect to anything?" "No," Thomas said. "It's just a pit." "Then we make a new way," Jedediah said. He grabbed a pickaxe from the wall. "Start digging." "Dig?" Thomas Monroe looked at Jedediah as if the old man had finally, truly lost his mind. "Dig where? The wall of that cellar is solid rock and clay." "Not that wall," Jedediah said, tapping the back wall of the forge, the one that pressed against the sheer sandstone bluff that formed the back of the settlement. "This here's just a front. The old Spanish prospectors, they dug all through here. There's a vent shaft, goes straight up to the ridge, but we gotta get to it from the cellar." He hefted the pickaxe. "It's our only chance." Thomas looked at the pickaxe, then at the cellar. He looked at his daughter, her face streaked with soot, clutching the Cheyenne infant. He heard the drums, a constant, low thunder that you felt in your teeth. He heard the occasional shout of Croft's men, moving through the town. He took the pickaxe from Jedediah. "Abby, take the baby to the cabin. Stay there. Bar the door. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Pa, I can help." "Do as I say, Abigail, now." She fled. Thomas and Jedediah disappeared into the cellar, pulling the trap door almost shut, leaving just a sliver for air. And then a new sound began, muffled by the earth. The thunk, thunk, thunk of a pickaxe hitting compacted dirt and shale. Abigail paced the small cabin, a prisoner. The baby was restless. His skin felt hot. He had a fever. She tried to give him more of the diluted condensed milk, but he wouldn't take it. He just whimpered, a weak, pathetic sound. "Please," she begged the child. "Please be quiet. They're trying to save us. Please." She sat on her cot, rocking him, as the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the shutters. The drums had not stopped. They had been joined by new sounds, a high, keening chant that rose and fell, a sound of profound grief. "They're mourning," she whispered, her heart aching. "They think he's dead." Then, the sound she had been dreading. Heavy footsteps on her cabin porch. A fist pounded on the door, making the wood rattle in its frame. "Abigail Monroe, open this door." It was Sheriff Brody's voice, but it was high-pitched, strained. Abigail froze. She couldn't see the forge, but she could no longer hear the digging. Her father and Jedediah must have heard the approach. "Open it or I'll kick it in." She had no choice. She put the baby in her mother's cradle, threw a blanket over it, and shoved it into the darkest corner of the room. She unbarred the door. Sheriff Brody stood there, his face pale and sweaty despite the morning chill. Behind him stood Silas Croft, looking as fresh as if he'd just awoken from a full night's sleep. His pale eyes swept the room, missing nothing. "Where's your father?" Croft demanded. He went out," Abigail stammered. "To check his traps." Croft smiled. "Check his traps, with the valley full of Cheyenne and drums beating all night. A likely story." He pushed past her, into the tiny cabin. "Where is he, girl?" "I told you, I don't know." Croft walked through the room. It took him 5 seconds. He saw the table, the 2 cots, the cold cook stove. His eyes fell on the cradle in the corner. He walked over to it. Abigail's blood felt like it had turned to ice. "Starting a family, Miss Monroe?" he asked, his voice silky. He reached down and yanked the blanket off. The baby was there, his eyes wide, his feverish face flushed. He was silent, just staring. Sheriff Brody gasped, his hand going to his pistol. "Lord have mercy, it's true." Croft smiled, a wide, genuine, terrifying smile. "Well, well, well," he said, "the lost prince. And right here." He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a predatory admiration. "You are a bolder girl than I thought." "I found him," Abigail said, trying to stand tall. "The Coyotes, they would have—" "Save your story," Croft snapped. "Brody, take the child." Sheriff Brody hesitated, his eyes on the baby. "Silas, it's just a baby." "It's leverage," Croft said. "It's the ace in our hand. It's the one thing that will stop those drums and save this town. Now take it." Brody reached for the cradle. "No!" Abigail screamed, launching herself at him. She was small, but she was fast, scratching and kicking. "Don't you touch him!" Brody yelped, stumbling back. Croft, with casual brutality, backhanded her. The force sent her crashing into the table, which overturned. "Insolent brat!" Croft spat. He scooped up the infant. The baby, shocked by the sudden, rough movement, let out a piercing wail. "There it is," Croft said, almost cooing. "Sing your song, little prince. Your father's been waiting to hear it." He turned and strode out the door, the baby in his arms. "Brody, get the militia. We're going to the ridge. We're going to make a trade." Abigail scrambled to her feet, her cheek stinging, and ran after him. "No, you don't know what you're doing. He's not just— You can't sell him?" She ran out into the main street. The town was awake. People were peering from their windows, their faces pale. Mrs. Pratchett was on her porch, a look of vindicated horror on her face. Croft's men, 6 of them, were already on horseback, rifles ready. "What's going on, Silas?" one of them asked. Croft held the wailing infant aloft, like a trophy. This is our salvation." At that exact moment, the digging in the forge stopped. The back door burst open. Thomas Monroe, covered in dirt, his face a mask of fury, ran out. He was holding the pickaxe. "Croft!" he roared. "Let go of her! Let go of the child!" Jedediah was right behind him. "You suicidal fool, Croft! You show that baby, you'll start a war, not stop one." Croft just laughed. "Look at this, the town blacksmith and the town drunk. My, Miss Monroe, you keep strange company." He settled the baby into the crook of his arm and drew his revolver. He didn't point it at Thomas. He pointed it at Abigail. "Drop the axe, Smithy, or the girl gets it. Then you. Then the old man." Thomas Munro looked at the gun. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the baby Croft was holding. The pickaxe fell from his hands, clattering into the dust. "That's better," Croft said. "Now, all of you. You're going to... Wait." Croft's head tilted. The smile on his face faded. The drums had stopped. The sudden absolute silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. The entire valley, the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. What is it?" Sheriff Brodie whispered, his hand shaking. And then a new sound. A single, high-pitched cry. A war cry. It didn't come from the valley. It came from the ridge above the town. It was answered by another cry from the east, and another from the west. They were surrounded. They used the tunnel," Jedediah whispered, his face ashen. They were waiting." "Get inside," Croft yelled, his composure finally breaking. He shoved the baby at Sheriff Brodie, who fumbled with him. "Bar the doors! To the saloon! It's the biggest building!" The townspeople shrieked and ran, scrambling for the saloon. Mrs. Pratchett tripped and fell, and no one stopped to help her. "Pa!" Abigail screamed. Thomas grabbed her. "With me! To the forge! It's solid!" He dragged her and Jedediah back toward the smithy. "Get them, Munro!" Croft bellowed, firing his pistol at Thomas's feet. "The forge! That's where they were! Set it ablaze!" Two of Croft's men, seeing their leader's plan, understood. While the rest of the town ran for the saloon, they ran to the general store. "What are they?" Abigail started. "Kerosene," Thomas whispered in horror. Croft and his men, dragging the terrified Sheriff Brodie, who was still clutching the baby, barricaded themselves in the saloon. The two other men emerged from the store, carrying heavy tins. They ran to the forge. "Pa, they're going to burn us out," Abigail said, her voice numb. "Get in the cellar," Thomas commanded. "Both of you, through the tunnel. Go." "The tunnel? It's not finished," Jedediah cried. "We hit solid granite." Thomas Munro looked at the door. He heard the splash of kerosene being sloshed against the outer walls. He looked at his daughter. "You suicidal madman," he roared, pulling open the door. "This is a forge, you idiots. There's coal dust. You'll blow the whole street to hell." One of the men, a young ranch hand named Billy, hesitated, torch in hand. He's right, Charlie. This is a bad idea." Croft said, "Burn it." The other man, Charlie, snarled. He was terrified, and terror made him vicious. He threw the torch. The wall of the forge didn't just catch fire, it exploded. The dry old wood, soaked in accelerant, went up with a whoosh that knocked all of them off their feet. A wall of flame and black smoke billowed into the dawn sky. The heat was instantaneous, blistering. Abigail screamed as her father, who had been closest to the door, was thrown backward, his shirt on fire. Abigail scrambled to her father, beating out the flames on his back with her bare hands, searing her palms. Thomas roared in pain and rage, rolling in the dust. The front of the forge was an inferno. "The tunnel!" Jedediah shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's the only way! The fire will suck the air from the cellar!" Thomas, his face blackened, staggered to his feet. He grabbed Abigail. "Go! Go!" He shoved her and Jedediah into the burning forge. The heat was unbelievable. Smoke filled the room, making it impossible to see, to breathe. "The trap door!" Jedediah was coughing, his eyes streaming. Thomas kicked the scrap metal aside. It was hot enough to burn his boot, and tore open the door. "In!" He pushed them down the ladder. Abigail stumbled, falling into the blackness. Jedediah landed on top of her. "Pa!" Abigail screamed, looking up. Through the smoke, she saw her father framed against the square of light. He was looking back, not at her, but at the saloon. "I'm coming," he choked. "Just get to the back." He slammed the trap door shut, plunging them into darkness. But this time, the darkness wasn't total. A few feet away, at the base of the back wall, was a ragged hole, just big enough for a person to crawl through. It was the tunnel, and from it, a faint, cool draught. He lied, Jedediah gasped, crawling toward it. He broke through. What? He must have broke through right before Croft came. He wanted us to have a way out, but he... Abigail understood. Her father wasn't coming. He hadn't stayed above to seal the door. He had stayed above to do something else. "Pa!" she screamed again, clawing at the trap door. But it was too heavy. "He's gone, girl." Jedediah grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "He's gone to get the child. Now move, or we roast in here." The old man's survival instinct was stronger than her panic. He dragged her into the narrow, suffocating blackness of the tunnel. It was a crawl space. Nothing more. They moved on hands and knees, over sharp rocks, the air thick with ancient dust. Behind them, they could hear the roar of the fire above the cellar, a hungry, terrifying sound. Outside, the street was chaos. The fire from the forge was spreading, a massive pillar of black smoke rising into the sky. The Cheyenne who had been hidden now revealed themselves. They weren't a massive war party, perhaps 30 warriors in all, but they were on the ridges, on the rooftops, materializing from the alleys. They held the town. Inside the saloon, panic. "They're everywhere!" Sheriff Brody was hyperventilating, holding the wailing baby. We're gonna die. Oh God, we're all gonna die." "Be quiet," Silas Croft snapped. He was at the window, his rifle out. "They haven't attacked. They're waiting." "For what?" "For him," Croft said, nodding at the baby. He grabbed the child from Brody. "We still have the advantage." He went to the batwing doors. "Black Moon!" he bellowed. "I have your son! He is alive! Call off your men! We'll trade!" There was no answer, just the crackle of the burning forge. And then, from the side of the saloon, a new sound, the crash of breaking glass. Thomas Monroe, his face a mask of soot and fury, had smashed a side window. Before anyone could react, he was inside. He wasn't armed with a gun. He was armed with a heavy, wrought-iron bar he'd grabbed from the smithy. "Give me the child, Croft!" he roared. Croft spun, startled. The half-dozen townsfolk and militiamen in the saloon scrambled back. This was not the quiet blacksmith. This was a vengeful demon risen from a fire. "Monroe!" Croft snarled, raising his pistol. Thomas didn't slow down. He swung the iron bar. Croft fired. The bullet went wide, the explosion deafening in the small room. Thomas's swing connected with Croft's wrist. There was a sickening snap. Croft screamed, dropping the pistol and the baby. Sheriff Brody, in a single, uncharacteristic act of competence, lunged and caught the infant before it hit the floor. Thomas raised the bar again, bringing it down on Croft's shoulder, dropping him to his knees. "You burned my home!" he bellowed, punctuating each word with a blow. "Stop! Monroe, stop! You'll kill him!" Brody yelled. Thomas stopped, his chest heaving, the bar raised for a final, fatal strike. He looked at Croft, who was whimpering, cradling his broken arm. He looked at Brody, who was holding the baby. "It's over, Thomas," Brody said, his voice shaking. "It's over." The saloon doors were pushed open, not by a warrior, by a woman. She was young, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her dress torn. A bleeding gash was bound at her temple. She was alone, and she was unarmed. She looked at the baby in Brody's arms, and her knees buckled. "Morning, Dove," a voice said. A warrior, tall and imposing, stepped in behind her. It wasn't Black Moon. This was a different man, his face painted, his eyes like stone. He was Stone Shield, the chief's brother. He looked at the scene, the cowering settlers, the broken croft, the wild-eyed blacksmith, and the sheriff holding the child. Mourning Dove, the baby's mother, got to her feet and walked slowly toward Sheriff Brody. She held out her arms. Brody looked at Stone Shield. He looked at Thomas. Then, very slowly, he handed the baby to its mother. She clutched the child to her chest, a profound, gut-wrenching sob escaping her. She buried her face in his swaddling, checking every finger, every toe, kissing his head. Stone Shield looked at Thomas. He nodded, a bare, fractional sign of respect. He then looked at Silas Croft. His expression turned to stone. He is the one, Thomas said, his voice hoarse. He took the child. He gave the order to burn my home. Croft, pale with pain, scrambled backward. It was a misunderstanding. We were trying to save him. From the fire. Stone Shield walked over to Croft. He didn't draw a weapon. He just looked at him. Then he reached down and, with one hand, hauled Croft to his feet. Croft cried out as his broken arm was jostled. Stone Shield dragged him, unresisting, out into the street. The fire at the forge was dying down. The Cheyenne warriors were still in their places, watching. They were not a war party. They were an audience. At the end of the street, a new group of riders appeared. At their head was a man who needed no introduction. Black Moon. He was not painted for war. He was dressed simply, but he radiated an authority that made the armed settlers look like children. He saw his wife. He saw his child, alive. His face, which had been a mask of grief, softened. He rode forward and dismounted. Mourning Dove ran to him, and they held each other, the baby between them. The entire town was silent. The crisis was over. The exchange had been made. Abigail and Jedediah crawled out of the tunnel, covered in filth, onto the ridge above the town. They looked down on the scene. Abigail saw her father, alive, standing outside the saloon. She saw the Cheyenne family, reunited. "He did it, Jed," she whispered, tears cutting paths through the grime on her face. "Pa did it." "He did," Jedediah said, his voice thick. "He ended it." But it wasn't over. Black Moon now turned his attention to the man Stone Shield was holding. He looked at Silas Croft. Black Moon faced Silas Croft. Croft, desperate, lied, "We rescued your son from the fire." But Black Moon knew the truth. He pointed to Abigail. She fought the night dogs. She saved him. He looked at Thomas's smouldering forge. Croft's final, desperate lie, blaming the Cheyenne for the Hannigan raid, died when Sheriff Brody refused to support him. Black Moon's justice was not death, but the land itself. His warriors stripped Croft of his horse, his weapons, and his boots. "You will walk," Black Moon declared, banishing him to the wilderness, leaving him to the spirits. With the cycle of violence broken, Black Moon turned to the town. He honored Jedediah's true heart, and he watched as his wife, Mourning Dove, placed a blue stone necklace around Abigail's neck. "You saved my life," the mother whispered. Black Moon gave a final warning to the settlers. "We do not seek war, but we are not weak. Remember this day." He raised his hand. The drums began a new rhythm, a journey home. The Cheyenne vanished. The town was left in silence. As the settlers dispersed, Thomas Monroe put an arm around his daughter. Jedediah nodded at the ruins. "Looks like you'll be needing a hand to rebuild." "Aye," Thomas agreed, looking at his daughter. "I reckon I will." In the Wild West, survival was a daily war. But the story of Abigail Monroe reminds us that true courage isn't about the fight you can win. It's about the stand you must take. She and her father lost their home, but they saved a life, and in doing so, stopped a war. They proved that in a land of brutality, a single act of compassion can be more powerful than 100 rifles. The valley was quiet, but it would never be the same. The price of peace was a forge, but the reward was a future. If this story of frontier courage and impossible choices moved you, please help us share more real-life dramas just like this. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. We honor the past by remembering the stories that shaped it. Thank you for listening.